Hey church, Wednesday night, that means it's time for another Revelation study. Tonight we'll be in chapter 12. We're going to get right into it. I'm not going to do a review. We'll do chapter 12 tonight. Next week, I'll do a review, everything leading up to the end of chapter 12. And then the following Wednesday night, we'll be in the sanctuary for chapter 13. So we'll get right into chapter 12. If you've ever had any problem with the study of Revelation, and a lot of people do, things kind of pop out of nowhere, seems like nothing's in order. It's kind of confusing in a lot of places. And the theme of Revelation is time. You have to figure out where everything lines up. Not everything is in order. We've already talked a couple times about the parenthetical chapters, which is things that are going on during all the other things that are happening. So it's just chapters that are adding to the story that's already being told. And then some things are in chronological order. The judgments all fall in chronological order. And so you got to kind of figure out the timeline of everything. And to help you do that, I'm going to set the stage tonight for how that kind of is and some of the things that's in the Bible about that. There's a thing that the writers of the Bible use. It's called the principle of reoccurrence, which means they'll give you two different timelines. And the first will be chronological in the order that they happen. And then they'll give you the same story, the same timeline, but it'll be in order of importance, what it means to the reader. The example that first comes to mind is Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 gives you the chronological order of creation, man being created last, and on day 6. And then if you go to Genesis chapter 2, they talk about man being created. And then it seems like everything else falls in reverse order. And they're not making a mistake, and it's not out of order, but the second part is in order of importance. So in the principle of reoccurrence, the first part will be chronological, and the second way it's given will be in order of importance. Revelations is the same way. There are two sections in Revelations. Chapter 4, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 18. Is the first section, and that's chronological order. That's the events that are happening in the order that they're going to happen. And then you get to section 11:19 through 19:6, and that second section is in order of importance. It hits the highlights, the main things that are going to happen, not necessarily in the proper order that you see from the first 11 chapters. So that takes us to chapter 12. And chapter 12 is very interesting. And if you would just look at the headings in chapter 12, and I hope you read that over the last couple of weeks. I hope you read chapter 12. But the headings of chapter 12 says the woman, the dragon, the war, and the persecution. And if you had no idea of the timeline or what they're talking about, it would completely confuse you. And this is not a parenthetical chapter. This is not a chronological chapter. Chapter 12 is kind of a thumbnail of history. So we're just going to walk through every verse in chapter 12 tonight and explain what the history lesson that we're being given in chapter 12 is. So chapter 12, verse 1 and 2 says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in labor and agony, and she was about to give birth." So the woman here being talked about, who is the woman? Some have said it's Mary. This represents Mary. I believe the Catholic Church believes that this woman in Revelation is Mary. But we'll see that this woman he speaks of has wings to fly to safety. There's no way that physically or symbolically this could be Mary. And some have said it's the church. And that doesn't fit either, because we'll see in a little while that this woman gives birth to the ruler of the world. And the church didn't give birth to Jesus. Jesus gave birth to the church. So the woman here in the first two verses is talking about the nation of Israel. And then the heading of the next section, the next three verses, is the dragon. It says in chapter 12, verse 3, it says, "Then another sign appeared in heaven. There was a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 crowns." Now this is talking about the authority on earth that the dragon will have. It says its tail swept away a third of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. And this was the angels that the devil brought with him from heaven, the ones that turned against God. It says, and the dragon stood in front of the woman, this is Israel, who was about to give birth, so that when she did give birth, it might devour her child. I want to stop there before we go any farther. The dragon here is Satan, and it'll go on to tell you in the next section of verses that the dragon that it speaks of here, the red fiery dragon, is Satan, the devil. And from the beginning of time, in fact, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, when Satan was handed his sentence that the seed of woman would crush his head, was looking for a way to stop that child from being born. And it talks about him waiting for the woman to give birth so he can devour. And from the very beginning, he began this. I think he started even at Abel. He tried to stop the seed of Eve by having Cain kill Abel. And that didn't work. And then he went on and I believe through different passages in the Old Testament, all the way through the Old Testament. We could go on and on about the way that Satan tried to stop the bloodline, even up to the point where the birth of Jesus happened. I believe Satan himself was in the throne room of Herod when Herod gave the order to have all the babies 2 years and younger killed to try and stop the birth of Jesus Christ. And so it's talking about, it's exactly what it says here. He's waiting for the woman to give birth, or Israel, and the child is the Messiah, or Jesus. And he couldn't stop it. And so it says, she gave birth to a son, a male who is going to rule all the nations with an iron rod. Now the word rule there is lead as a shepherd. It's not going to be a tyrant. It's not going to be a evil ruler. He will rule all the nations like a shepherd. And it says with an iron rod, and what that means is iron is representative of truth. So it symbolizes truth. So he will lead all nations. He will rule all nations as a shepherd, and he will rule them by truth. And it says her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And this was, of course, the ascension of Jesus Christ. And the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God to be nourished for 1,260 days. And we talked about last week, or the week before last, 1,260 days is 3.5 years. So for the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, Israel will have to flee from the dragon who will cause war with the children of God. For all those that stand for Jesus, he will cause war with them. So they have to flee into the wilderness, into the mountains for 3.5 years to a place where God had prepared them to protect them. In verse 7 through 12 seems a little out of place, but this is still part of the history lesson. Verse 7 says, then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels also fought, but he could not prevail, and there was no place for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was thrown out, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. See, that's where it explains who the dragon is, the one who deceives the whole world. He was thrown to earth, and his angels with him. So this is the war in heaven, and this goes back to, and if you're taking notes, and I hope you are, write down Isaiah chapter 14, 12 through 15, and look that up. And that will explain what Revelation is just talking about, where Satan is being kicked out of heaven. There's the war in heaven, and Satan is being kicked out. And it goes on to say, then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have now come, because the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before God day and night, has been thrown down. So this is what he's saying. He said, salvation and power and kingdom has come through the authority of Christ, because the accuser of the brethren, and Satan is called the accuser of the brethren, and he accuses day and night. Have you ever been accused of something? And nobody likes to be accused of anything, whether it be face to face, whether it be behind your back. These days, most likely it's going to happen on social media. You'll be accused of something, and that drives me absolutely crazy. But you know what? Satan does it every day and every night. He is constantly accusing you, and by you I mean a child of God. If you're a Christian, if you're a child of God, Satan is accusing you day and night before God, saying, and the accusations will be, they're not going where they need to be going. They're not doing what they need to be doing. They're saying stuff they ought not to say. They're mean, they're selfish, they're jealous. And although Satan is the father of lies, he doesn't make any of this up. The Bible says all the accusations, nothing is said about him making any of that up. It's stuff that we actually are doing, and he's bringing it before God, and he's saying, look at what they're doing. Look the way they're living. How can you love them? How can they make it to heaven when you kicked me out of heaven and you're going to let them in? Day and night, he's accused. But look what it goes on to say. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they did not love their lives to the point of death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great fury. And look what this part says. Because he knows his time is short. He has 3.5 years to make war with the enemy. I want you to know in this chapter, verses 1 through 6 and in verses 7 through 17 are all happening at the exact same time. They're all parallel. It's not one happening than the other. They're both happening at the same time. And I want you to look at what he says, the accuser of the brethren. I talked about he accuses you day and night. And he's telling stuff to God that we are guilty of. So where is our hope? Well, our hope, 1 John chapter 2, verse 1 says, My little children, I am writing you these things so that you may not sin. But if anyone does, he has an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. So what an advocate is like an attorney. Satan is the prosecutor. He is accusing us day and night of all the things that we have done wrong, of all the reasons we ought not to go to heaven. And we have a defense attorney. And our defense attorney as children of God is Jesus Christ. And so when the accuser says all these things and God turns to Jesus, our defense attorney, Jesus simply says, they're mine. I've taken care of that. I've covered that. They are mine. And then the rest of the chapter says, when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman, which is the nation of Israel, who had given birth to the male child, which is Jesus. So the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent's presence to her place in the wilderness, where she was nourished for times, and half a time. And what that means is 3.5 years. Time is 1, times is plural, that's 2, and then a half time is a half a year. So for 3.5 years, just like he mentioned earlier, the children of Israel will be nourished in the wilderness during what the dragon will bring a war against them. And it goes on to say, from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river flowing after the woman to sweep her away with the flood, but the earth helped the woman. The earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the river that the dragon had spewed from its mouth. So anything that the devil does at this time to overtake the Jews, God will take care of them. So the dragon was furious with the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold firmly to the testimony about Jesus. So this was everyone that has been saved at that time. All those that kept the commandments of God and the testimony about Jesus. And that finishes up chapter 12. And then it says, and what I want you to, and this is the way I'd like to finish this chapter especially, it talks about overcoming the dragon with the word of their testimony. And this is how they overcome. So they conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they did not love their lives to the point of death. And there are 3 things I want you to focus on from this chapter, and that's how they overcame the devil. The first was conversion. They conquered it by the blood of the Lamb. You cannot possibly win this fight without being saved, without being converted. You can't win without being a child of God. There is no overcoming. And then after the conversion, it talks about the confession. It said, and by the word of their testimony. I've heard people say, I'm a child of God. I've given my life to Jesus, but I don't talk about it. People can just see it through my life. And that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Because Jesus lived a perfect, sinless life, and they still didn't believe him. So for you to think that you could live good enough to where you wouldn't have to mention the name of Jesus, they would just see it in your life, is ridiculous. Confession is a must for a child of God. And if you haven't confessed Jesus Christ, you need to do that today. And then last is commitment. It said they did not love their lives even to the point of death. In other words, they were willing to give up their life. They were committed to Jesus Christ. And as children of God, we need to be committed. The Bible says if we are to be rulers, we must first be servants. For us to live, we must die. If we want to be first, we must be last. And that's where that commitment comes in. So if you've listened to this study, if you've been listening to studies, or if this is the first time you've ever listened to this, you need to have those 3 C's in your life. You need to be converted. You need to confess Jesus Christ, and you need to be committed to it. So I pray if you're watching this and you haven't, that you do it right now, that you give your heart and your life to Jesus Christ, that you're converted, that you confess. Tell somebody. I always say, if you've ever given your heart and your life while watching one of my videos, please put it in the comments. Confess that Jesus Christ is now the Lord of your life, and then get committed to Him. Serve Him. Love Him. Be a witness to Him. Conversion, confession, and then commitment. And it was those 3 things that they became overcomers. And we will be overcomers if we keep those 3 things in our life. Now that finishes up chapter 12. Again, next week we will do another video, and I'll wrap up everything that we've done from chapter 1 until chapter 12. And I'll keep it short. We'll just run through the lineup of what has happened. And then the following Wednesday night, we'll be back in church. I believe it's the 10th. We'll be back in the sanctuary. And so we'll be able to face-to-face talk about chapter 13, which is the Antichrist, the beast. A very, very good chapter of Revelations. So until then, I pray that you go ahead and read chapter 13. If you haven't studied all these and read all these, read everything up unto chapter 13 for next week. And I'll see you again next Wednesday night for our continued study of the book of Revelations. God bless.